guys, OtterPop here. So today I'm bringing you another art video, but this one's going to be a little bit different because instead of a speed draw, I'm doing a speed paint this time. And I'm going to be giving a little bit of commentary while I do so because I thought that, talking a little about my thought process was going to be kind of neat. So I'm not going to be revealing what I'm actually, doing, but I figured I'd kind of talk a little bit about the thought process. So first off, I'm painting, a lot of, what is it again? I think it's Brilliant Blue onto a canvas. And again, this is primarily just like, kind of starting on the background and stuff. And you notice how I might paint the sides and the edges of the painting a bit as well. I kind of like doing that personally. I mean, some other people might not do it, but I don't know why. I just kind of like doing it. So this segment's going to be maybe a slight bit confusing, but I'm actually adding orange to the painting because this is how acrylic paintings work. If you want to darken a color, but keep the saturation, so, keep it to like darken a color. Or, no, that's not exactly right. But if you want to darken a color but still have it, have that vibrance about it, then you add its complement. And in this case, blue's complement is orange. So that's what I did. Because, you might use black, but then it loses a little bit of that saturation, which is what I've noticed with a lot of acrylic paints. So, blue has its complement as orange. So if you want to darken orange, just add a little bit of blue, and that should have the exact same effect. And I started adding a little bit of black, I believe, in this instance, just to like some parts of the painting, at least like the kind of left side.
The right side, not quite as much. I've also just noticed that there's a little bit of like a sort of small reflection. That's how much paint is on the canvas right now. It's not really a lot, but it's enough that it creates a little bit of a reflection, which is actually kind of cool. So the next thing that I started doing was adding some phthalo green. That kind of sounds weird to pronounce, but it's spelled P-H-T-H-L-O. It's a pretty common green, especially with some paint brands out there. I personally use Artistloff. I don't paint very often, and I'm not good enough to be a professional painter or anything like that. But there were some white parts on the bottom of the canvas, which I did not paint. Also, that's me just getting the top of it real quick. But there were a couple of bottom parts that I didn't. Oh yeah, see what I was talking about earlier? Is I'm adding some red to the green to darken it up a little bit, which is actually kind of working. We want to be careful though not to add too much of a complement to the original color, because then it'll start looking a little bit like a brown, which in this case it kind of does.
My camera wasn't able to correctly, capture the accuracy of the color, but I can absolutely promise that it looked very green. And this is where I started adding a little bit different green colors. Either I started adding a little more phthalo green, or no, I think I started adding phthalo green. But you'll also notice that I'm starting to do something a little bit different, where I'm starting to kind of make like shapes with the green itself. That's because I'm starting to paint trees, like just general trees. I'm not doing anything like super specific, because that's just frankly not what I wanted to do. But I wanted there to be enough green that geez, I completely forgot what I was saying, but I've actually never had to do one of these before, so it's a little bit unusual for me. But anyways, so yeah, I've started just making a lot of little random shapes of trees, and as you can see, I'm adding a little bit more orange, because again, orange is green, or, jeez. Wow, I just totally had a brain fart right there, yes. Orange is green's complement, and vice versa, green is orange's complement, so I wanted to darken it just a little bit, hence the orange. This is actually where I started adding a lighter green that I had on hand, sap green, and I was just adding it to some of the tops of the trees, and I won't explain now, but there's a reason that I'm doing it just to certain areas of the trees and not others. And if you can tell by the brush strokes, I know it's really fast, I apologize, but this is how speed paint works. But I'm also, in addition to me painting with the sap green, I'm also trying to blend the lighter green with the darker green that's already established on the trees. And I think there were a couple points at this where I was having a bit of difficulty, accidentally getting not the bristles of the brush, but the actual metal part of the brush itself. I was starting to almost semi-scrape that onto some parts of the painting, which made a few of the aspects of the painting a slight bit more difficult, but it happens sometimes. Again, I have not painted in many months, so it's something that I was kind of trying to get used to. So again, still adding a little bit more sap green to kind of lighten up certain areas. So this is actually where things start to get a slight bit tricky. So I'm starting to add a bit of a semicircle, technically, a half circle into the sky, which, if it wasn't obvious, it's supposed to be the moon. I was having some difficulty with my white paint, and I'm still not entirely sure why, but I was having to put on multiple layers, but none of them were sticking properly, and by now I let the blue paint, the blue and the black and the orange paint in the background dry off enough. This is actually where I had a little bit of fun, where I was literally just dotting all different parts of the darkened sky with, what was it? It was little pricks of 3 different colors. It was lemon yellow, it was white, and it was unbleached titanium. I was doing all kinds of different, again, just tiny little dots or slightly bigger ones for the stars. Now, knowing me, I probably would have been a bit anal retentive enough where I would have tried creating, like, you know, like actual stars and constellations out of this, but I decided to be a bit more random because I was actually, at that point, I was a lot more concerned about the next major aspect of the painting that I was supposed to paint, so I didn't really get too particular, but again, I tried to be very diverse with the stars that I was putting on place. You know, a whole bunch of big ones and little ones, you know, next to each other in clusters or something like that. And, of course, I'm trying to go over the moon again, you know, trying to figure out, but it's not completely working. But I also start adding a little bit of a lighter blue, a cerulean blue that I had. I was starting to add that to the edge of the moon to start to define the moon's shape just a little bit. And because, you know, if you look at a moon in the night sky, you'll notice that there's like a sort of slight aura around it that's lighter than everything else. So that was kind of the idea for what I did for the cerulean blue. But I obviously didn't work on it a little bit more until much later. So here is actually the main subject of the painting. I won't say anything yet, but maybe you can kind of guess based on the shape alone. So this is where I started using, what was it, some burnt sienna for an initial first layer with unbleached titanium on the top, and then I tried to use just a slight bit of burnt sienna on top of that to create this sort of like this sort of blended color. And I use a little bit more unbleached titanium as well. And again, this is actually the first time I've done a painting like this where I'm just putting the color straight onto the canvas and, you know, blending and, you know, painting and stuff. Normally I have a palette, and I still have that palette with me, of course, but this was actually the first time where I just basically put the paint onto the canvas and just rolled with it. Like, this is all just coming out of my head all at once. So there's a bit of a shape. It looks a little funky at first, and I promise it'll look a little bit better later. But there's like a sort of slight outline of, I believe it was burnt sienna, around this sort of heart-shaped icon. Again, maybe some of you can kind of guess what's going on, or like what the subject is. I mean, given everything else, it maybe should be a not really slight bit obvious, but I'm sure plenty of you can take a pretty good guess. But here's where I started adding some burnt umber into the mix. I can't remember if I have a bigger tube of that or just a little one. And as you can see, there, yeah, I fudged up that eye a bit slightly, but once I started filling them in, I started getting the proportions a bit more right. And again, like, I use a bunch of random reference images just to kind of get a good feel for how some things might look. But again, most of this is just coming out of my mind just randomly. Like, I'm just coming up with all this stuff. So at this point is when I start working on the outline of the body, and I am still using burnt sienna. Burnt sienna? Right? Yes, burnt sienna. I had to think about it. I had to look at my paints again for a moment and think about that. But yeah, I'm starting to do the body, and I'm also starting to do the tail, and again, it's just filling in some basic outline colors. And again, by this point, the blue in the background is completely dry. So right now I'm actually starting to use a little bit of burnt umber for some shading effects, which I really shouldn't have started doing right away since I technically hadn't finalized a couple of the colors, but that's okay. I learned my mistake. Sometimes things happen. But either way, I'm you know, trying to do a slight bit of blending. So this is actually where it got a slight bit interesting. So okay, I almost completely forgot I did that part. I used unbleached titanium for an outline for where and how far the wing would come out, the right wing at least, and then I finished it, well, not finished technically, but then I started using some burnt sienna to sort of get that get the actual shape out. And now I'm starting to do the opposite with the left wing, where I'm using the unbleached titanium for, like, you know, a simple outline, and then I'm probably, well, actually the left wing is going to have a lot more unbleached titanium than the right, which has a little bit more of burnt sienna, but at least at this point it should be pretty obvious, like, you know, how the wings are going to be shaped. And again, none of this is final quite yet. These colors and these, like, little outlines I'm doing are just that. They're just outlines to get me started for what's going to be coming later. But again, oh, looks like I may have fudged it up slightly, but if I recall correctly, I ended up having that work in my favor. So starting to put a little bit more definition, I guess, onto the tips of the wings with the feathers and all that, hence that little mistake that actually turned out to be pretty useful later on. So, you know, not a big deal. And granted, looking back at it, the wing does seem a bit small, but again, I hadn't painted in a while, and, you know, it doesn't look too bad of a proportion. So there is that. And again, I was just coming up with all this very randomly, so if I had known about, you know, the proportions and stuff, I probably would have moved the owl a little bit more to the left, and probably might have made it a slight bit smaller, so that way the wings would have been bigger and it would have maybe looked a little bit better. Anyways, back to the body. So I realized my mistake earlier, and I'm like, okay, I need to change this up a little bit, so I added some unbleached titanium for basically the belly of the owl and the underside of the tail. And I was starting to use a little bit of mostly burnt sienna, or I'm sorry, mostly burnt umber, but I was also using a slight bit of burnt sienna to sort of blend all the colors together to create what's going to eventually be the more final shading effects. And sometimes the blending wouldn't work out perfectly, so I might get my brush just a slight bit wet to sort of blend it a little bit better. So here I am, I'm using some burnt sienna to outline the top of the wing. Again, like, it's just more than anything like a kind of general outline, but it does give you a good feel for, like, you know, what the wings are doing as the owl is flying. How one of them is kind of, you know, down and tilted out, or tilted downward or something like that. I don't know how you would say that, really. Where the other one is starting to flap upwards. So, I mean, given the fact that I just kind of came up with this on the spot, I mean, again, I did use a couple of random reference images to kind of get a better idea for what I might do, but considering this is what the final product kind of turned out to be, I actually think it looked pretty cool. So here's where I start using, overall, I start using smaller brushes for more definitive, not really outlines, but more like definitive details, I guess you could say. With a variety of the colors. And of course, at this point, I'm also starting to color in and fill a lot of the blue spots that are still left over from my earlier outline, which, pretty smart decision to do, because, you know, owl wings, they're not transparent or anything like that. Ooh, I just fudged it up. I saw what I did. Don't worry, I will be fixing that in probably just about a moment. Like, yep, right there. And again, it looks a lot lighter, but by the time it dries, it's going to look a little bit darker. Okay, so that's right. I did do this, and I did extend the wing out just a little bit. Again, it's still not perfect, but it's really not that bad. It really isn't. I probably could have done the same with the left, but a part of me really didn't want to do that. Because, I don't know, I was just kind of a sucker for, you know, the moon existing there. I'm starting to do this sort of semi-blending effect, you know, with the wing being, you know, how it's like bent in a little bit, but I eventually kind of scrapped that and started to do a little bit more like covering that color and blending. I'm gonna fix that later, but I know what the initial idea was. So this is actually where I'm focusing on the legs. I did fudge up a slight bit with the proportions on this, but what are you gonna do? I did some unbleached titanium for the legs, and then I used some burnt umber. I almost said sienna. I used some burnt umber for the, some burnt umber for the claws, and then I started to use, I couldn't exactly tell if that was burnt sienna or burnt umber that I used for blending effects. It could have been either or, but it would have had pretty similar to the same effect. This is also where I started to make the tail a little bit bigger too, because it just didn't look quite right. And of course I'm using some more, blending colors and things like that. Oh my gosh, why does my throat hurt so much? Sheesh. I swear it's not the COVID. My sinuses have been acting up on me all day, but that's just my sinuses. What are you gonna do? So yeah, starting to fix the tail a little bit, and second time around, it does seem to look a lot better. But here's where I started adding a bunch of burnt umber for some, feather-like attributes. Not just to the underside of the tail, but to the wings as well. This was actually kind of fun, because I didn't have to be super specific with this, and it didn't matter how dark or light some of these features were, because as long as it was clear that they existed, I could really just kind of do what I wanted. Like, it didn't matter how dark or light some of these were. So yeah, as you can see, I clearly had a little bit of fun with it, and then just started doing randomness from that point on. It was really fun to do it for the left wing, and I could do it a little bit for the right wing, and of course, the underside just a little bit, but nothing was too specific. I started adding some slightly darker effects and some random facial features as well, like, the weird stripes and the dots, because, again, this is a painting, and I'm an artist, and I'm kind of free to do what I want. So, I can't remember. I think it was Brilliant Red that I might have used, or Crimson. I can't remember which one I used for adding a slight bit of, popping color to the wings and, the backside of the body especially. It was just a little bit. It wasn't a lot. I started using a little bit more burnt umber in that instance right then. Oh, I did do a little bit more with the legs, it looks like. But I did start adding more prominent shading effects. I think there's still a slight shading effect on the wing, actually. Thinking back, I'm not sure if I continued with that, but what are you gonna do? So then I turned back to the moon, and I think it was around this point where I started switching. Oh no, never mind. I added some unbleached titanium to it instead, and I probably started adding a different white paint that I had, which might have worked. I mean, it looks like it might have worked. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, I would say it worked. I know that eventually I did have to change some of the moon proportions just a slight bit. Can't remember if that was right now at this point or if it was a little bit later. It might have been this point, looking at it. Again, just changing, because it almost looked like a slightly flattened hemisphere, so I just had to enlarge it ever so slightly. So here's where I actually started adding a lot more cerulean blue to the outside edges of the moon. Caught a little white in the bleached titanium as well, but that actually kind of helped in my favor to give it that semi-glowing effect. It's when you're a sort of amateur / hobbyist painter, it's kind of hard to get some of those noticeable glowing effects. I mean, I think I did it reasonably well, but it's just kind of, tricky to achieve when, you're not like a professional painter or anything like that. So here's where I started to define the moon a little bit more, and by now I'd probably added a bunch of different layers of paint of either white or unbleached titanium onto the moon, so it kind of had a weird rugged appearance, but again, that kind of ended up working in my favor, because that's kind of how the moon actually looks in a way. Not in the same way, but in a similar way. And then I also started adding a bunch more stars, and again, I'm not sure why I found this as fun as I did. And again, if I wasn't so concerned about, the owl itself early on, I might have actually gone a little bit above and beyond and tried to add a bunch more, random constellations to it or something. Especially because the individual that I'm painting this for, who is my best friend, she likes stars, she likes constellations, and especially loves Roman and Greek mythology and whatnot. So I also, at this point, started to finalize details on the eyes, where I was, adding all the black. I started to add a little bit of white for some sort of semi-reflection, I guess you could say, and it didn't totally work. It kind of backfired on me a slight bit, but I think I managed to fix it enough where, it looked pretty good, I would say. It looks pretty good. So there is that. Oh, my camera did a little shaky thing for a moment. So then I started adding a little bit more of the sap green. So remember when I said earlier that I was adding lighter green effects to the tops of the trees, but I didn't say why? Well, this is primarily why, is because, with the moon being in the background shining, even with just half light, it still shines enough that it can produce an impact on the trees, so I tried to reflect that as best I could. Again, not perfect, but what can you do? And actually looking back too, that orange I thought that I was putting in the green the second time might have actually been me adding the burnt sienna, or adding a little bit of burnt sienna into a couple of random places on the trees to give it a slight color, like with like branches and whatnot. Just a slight. It's a very subtle thing, but I think it worked. So with this, because again, I'm applying the knowledge of, or I'm applying what I did with the trees to the owl now, where I'm adding some unbleached titanium to the top of the owl's body and the edges of some of the wings to give it that sort of, lighting, glow kind of effect. And I actually think I did pretty well, especially on the back. Maybe the wings not so much, but, this is what it looks like. And it's not perfect, but I think it looks pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with it. And I really, I really do hope that my best friend likes it. I still have yet to actually send it to her, because it's kind of tricky to find a way to, put that in a package and send it. Maybe I just have to go to the USPS. But it was still a lot of fun to make, and I really hope she likes it, and I'm glad you all stuck with me, and I hope you liked my commentary. Maybe you learned a thing or two, but I thought it would be cool to kind of talk a little bit about my process. So thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this art video, and as usual, until the next video, guys, check you laters.